So session 3 of My God and My King. And so far we've looked at how God is king over all creation, and yet he chose to rule through the human beings that he had created. So he gave that mandate to Adam, but Adam failed. He brought sin into the world. But God did not give up then. He chose Abraham to become the father of a nation, and that nation was to be the ones who shed the glory of God throughout the earth. They began as a people under God, and the prophets would lead them to do what God wanted them to do. But they asked for an earthly king. And so God chose Saul. And we read how Saul failed to rule according to God's commands, and so he lost the kingdom, and David was given the kingship. But even David, great king that he was, and he really did love God, but he failed too. The story of Israel continues, and it seems to go from bad to worse as they disobey and they worship other gods. It seems to have been a dismal failure, but God did not give up on them. They were taken into exile by the people of Babylon. At the end, it was Judah who were the last ones to be taken into exile, where they were gone from their land, and like the whole kingdom of Israel no longer existed. And they felt that they had been deserted by God. Psalm 137:4, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? So had God's purpose failed? Well, no. God did not give up on them. Even while they were in exile, the prophet Isaiah wrote this: say to those who are fearful, have fearful hearts, be strong and do not fear. Your God will come. He will come with vengeance. With divine retribution, he will come to save you. And then in Isaiah chapter 40, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed. Her sin has been paid for. She has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice of one calling, in the desert, prepare the way for the Lord. Make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God. You see, to human eyes it would seem that God's plans had been totally crushed. But God remained true to his plan, and he was going to restore Israel. He actually used the king of Persia to do this. Now, the king of Persia was not a believer in God, but God used him. And so the king allowed some of the exiled people to start going back to Jerusalem. He even gave them money and everything they needed to start rebuilding the city. It was God's plan. In the book of Daniel, in chapters 1 and 2, we read how King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had a dream. And in his dream he saw this enormous statue, and it was made of different materials. But in the dream, each part of the statue was destroyed, one after the other, until finally a rock sort of came out of the mountain and smashed the last one to pieces. Now, Daniel was a young Israelite who'd been taken into exile, but he remained faithful to God, and he was able to interpret this dream to the king. What he said was, each part of the statue represented a kingdom, and each kingdom would come one after the other. But each one would be destroyed one after the other. And then in chapter 2, verse 44, we read this: in the time of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it itself will endure forever. This is the meaning of the vision of the rock cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands. A rock that broke the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver and gold to pieces. In the midst of their darkest times, there's the promise of God that his plans will never fail. Rather, he will conquer everything.